Hey everyone, and welcome to the next chapter. Today we're going to cover chapter 14 in our textbook, which is over evolution and Darwin. So let's get started. Okay, so first let's start by defining what evolution is. By definition, evolution is species change over time. And this thought process or this theory explains a lot of the unity and diversity we see amongst the creatures of life. So, for example, if we look at these images to the right, you'll see various animals. These animals are closely related. They have a lot of similar characteristics that they share. However, they are still somewhat different. They have lots of similarities. Let's just look at a few of them. So, for example, they all kind of have brownish fur. They all have four legs. They all have hooves. They all have antlers. What else? They all have the same body plan, meaning they have four limbs. They walk on those four limbs. They walk on four legs instead of two, like us. We are bipedal. They walk on all fours. So there's lots of similarities here, but there's also some differences. So, for example, the moose here is much larger than the deer. In this species here, the female and males both have antlers. Well, whereas in the other species, only the male has antlers. The pattern to the antlers changes. So this is our white-tailed deer that we're pretty familiar with probably in this area. And they have this structure for their antlers. Whereas if you compare them across other species, the structures or the format or the plan, the body plan for the antler growth is different from species to species. So they're very similar, but they still have differences. And evolution explains why we have this unity, these similarities, but these differences as well. So that's what evolution is. So this thought process, or as it was a thought process back in this time in 1831, began with Charles Darwin. And at this time, Charles Darwin was only 22 years old. He was college educated. He, as part of his studies, he desired to travel the world and observe his environment around him. We call those people naturalists. They like to observe the natural world. So what he did was he traveled on a boat. It was called the HMS Beagle. And he traveled to various locations around the world on the HMS Beagle over a period of 5 years. And this 5-year period, he allowed him to stop at multiple locations along the southern hemisphere in order to make observations around him. So this picture here demonstrates his path. So he started off here in England. That's where he's from originally. And he passed through this way, making a stop here in Africa. Then going forward, we were in South America now. And there's various stops you can see around here, the Galapagos Islands as well. Traveling this way, we're going to the other side of the map. So that would be over here, down through Australia, back around Africa, and eventually back home to England. So this took 5 years, and along the way, all of these stops, he made observations about the natural world around him. For example, he primarily looked at animals and compared animals from his home country as well as to animals around the world. So his observations led him to conclude that biological evolution occurs. And this was different from the thought processes of the time. During this time, evolution was not thought to occur. It was thought that species were unchanged, but his journey told him otherwise. So before Darwin, people had a very different way of viewing the world. At that time, again, this is in the 1830s, people believed, it was generally accepted, that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. However, due to a lot of evidence that has been collected over the course of many, many years, since 1830-ish, we have now gained enough as evidence as scientists to say that the Earth is actually more around 4.6 billion years old. 4.6 billion years old. Billion. Very, very old. Another commonly thought thing in the 1830s was that species remained the same since the dawn of creation. And again, Darwin's observations led him to feel otherwise. Darwin wasn't the only one that was interested in this field of work. Many explorers would bring back fossils that they had collected on their journeys. And fossils, by definition, are remains of a once living organism. So bones would be a great example of a fossil. An imprint, like a footprint, would be a great example. Or even the imprint of bones would be an example of a fossil. Feces. Yes, there is fossilized species that exist. That was another great example of a fossil. So those are just 3 examples. But they are remains of once living organisms. Now, these fossils are found in rock layers. We call these rock layers strata of the Earth. So this picture here gives a great representative strata. So if you look at this picture, you'll see that there's various colors of rock that are in horizontal patterns. Horizontal means like this. Vertical means up and down. Horizontal is left to right. So you can see those layers in the rock here. So those layers are called the strata of the Earth soil. All right. One of the individuals that were interested in this field of work was Georges Cuvier. He was the founder of paleontology. Paleontology is the study of fossils. Remember, break down your words. Ology means study of something, and paleo means something really old, like fossils. So he believed in the fixity of species, but the strata showed a succession of different forms over time. So his thoughts were that catastrophes happened, and that caused some of these new forms to replace old forms. This thought process was called catastrophism. All right, so that was George Cuvier's conclusion of all of these different fossils that he found that seemed to show similar species replacing older species. Another person of interest is John Baptiste de Lamarck. His thought process led him to believe in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So acquired, what does that mean? I want you to think about that. What does acquired mean? If you acquire something, you gain it, right? You gained a characteristic. So an example of that would be long necks in giraffes, or this was his thought process. This is not actually how it happens for real, but this is what he was thinking at the time. So the long necks that are seen in giraffes, he thought that the long neck was because they were stretching to reach food. Right? So here we have our original shorter neck giraffe, and over time its neck gets longer and longer because of simply reaching. This is the same giraffe in all of these pictures, just over time. Like this would be the young giraffe, and this would be the older giraffe, and then the neck becomes longer and longer due to the fact that it is reaching for food. So it's acquiring that long-necked characteristic over the course of its lifetime. However, that is not supported by scientific evidence today. And it wasn't supported by Darwin either. The reason for that, because if that were true, if we acquired characteristics in our over time, the people who were blinded in an accident, for example, would then also have blind children. If we acquire these characteristics and it altered our inherent ability of our traits, then whatever we acquired in life will be passed down to our offspring. So, for example, the knowledge you accumulated over your lifetime will be passed down to your children, but that's not the case. As an infant, a child does not, have the knowledge capacity or the things that, or doesn't know the things we know. They gain those over the course of their own lifetime. So that kind of debunks the thought processes that John Baptiste de Lamarck had. Now, Darwin's ideas were close to Lamarck's. However, he said that species are suited to the environment through no will of their own. So that means that the giraffe's neck isn't getting longer because the giraffe wants a longer neck because he needs it for food. Instead, he described what his theories were as natural selection. And this is the way he thought that evolution occurred. This is basically a mechanism for how evolution occurs. So, natural selection means that organisms are selected for based on their characteristics that they have compared to their environment. So, for example, here's another giraffe example. The giraffe's neck length is fixed based on its genes, but only the ones that have the genes for the traits that are beneficial survive and reproduce to pass on those traits to their offspring. So in Darwin's thought processes, he said, okay, here we have two giraffes, a long-necked one and a short-necked one, and the long-necked giraffe will be able to reach the food source and thus be able to live and survive and reproduce, whereas the short-necked giraffe won't be able to reach that foliage to consume and thus will die. And if the short-necked giraffe dies, then his traits and the genes that are associated with those traits will quote-unquote die with it because they can't be passed on to the next generation, thus leading to a population of giraffes that have longer necks. So this is called descent with modification. Offspring are going to be a result of parents that are procreating, and the ones that procreate are the ones that have the genes for traits that lead them to be able to survive and reproduce better than their peers. Okay, so this shows you a comparison of those two thought processes, Lamarck's on the left and Darwin's on the right. So in Lamarck's proposal, he said that originally giraffes had short necks, and because giraffes stretched their necks in order to reach the food, that continual stretching allowed for the neck to become longer and thus the production of long-necked giraffes when they reproduced, because he believed in the inheritance of acquired, y'all, I cannot spell, so don't kill me if this is wrong, acquired characteristics. Okay? Darwin's proposal was different. Originally, the giraffe neck length varied. So we had some short-necked giraffes, we had some long-necked giraffes, we have some medium-necked giraffes. And the ones that had the shorter neck struggled to exist because the long-necked giraffes would outcompete them for food. And of course, if the ones that are eating, they're going to be the ones that survive. They're going to be the ones that reproduce. But the giraffes that did not have long necks, that had shorter necks, they were going to invest more of their energy into just remaining alive and trying to get food. They're not worried about mating. And oftentimes those that struggled to consume food would die from starvation. And thus their genes would die out with them. And then the long-necked giraffes would breed and thus produce more long-necked giraffes. So that's Darwin's view. And we call that natural selection. Basically, the environment is selecting for, with no will or intent, organisms that are that are able to live in that environment. So again, like the giraffes, their food source is up high. If the food source was down low, then all the giraffes would be able to live and eat and survive and reproduce. But that's not the case. Their food source is up high in the trees, so that long neck benefits them, and thus the long neck is passed down from generation to generation. Okay, so Darwin's conclusions were based upon 3 main factors. The first one was geology and fossils. Geology is the study of the Earth's crust. And Darwin collected fossils along his voyage. Again, took 5 years on the HMS Beagle. And over the course of his journeys, he eventually accepted that Earth must be very old. Again, remember, at this time period, most people thought the Earth was only a couple thousand years old. But after collecting all of these fossils and seeing how they compared to modern day skeletons of modern organisms, he established that the Earth's probably a lot older than we think it is. And today we know that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. So with this new found thought, if the Earth is a lot older than we think it is, then that allows for something that occurs really slowly, like evolution, to occur. So he established that species are not fixed, but change over time, based on his study of geology and fossils. So a little bit more info on fossils that are found in the strata. So typically fossils are going to be found below the Earth's crust, and they can be pretty deep, or they can be, not quite as deep, but it's going to be all in this layer here of rock bed. And what happens is organisms will die, right? They're going to be on top of the Earth, right? They're going to be on the dirt. So you may be wondering, well, how did they get down here? So typically these remains of past life, these remains of organisms, are going to be rained on at some point, because of course it rains. And when it rains, those fossils